I want to share with you part of the story of Abraham. This comes from Acts 7, 1 and 2. Drums, wails, and magical chants. Abram woke to a touch on his arm. The small stone house had finally cooled. Overhead, the high ripe moon made dusk of the night. From the temple heights, there came a clamor of violent worship. "Are they at it again?" he asked. He turned to his wife. Even in the half-light, her face was lovely. A daughter of chieftains, Abram could see the old kingdoms, even Akkad, in her lips and chin. Sarai pressed his arm. "Not them," she said. "He's back." Abram started. He rose from his bed on the roof and looked down. Sure enough, at his door there waited one like a son of man. He stood in the light of the moon. Abram felt his allure, his call. He put on a shawl and went down. "Let's take a walk," the Elohah straightaway said, in a voice that Abram had come to adore. He turned and strode down the street. Abram followed. The houses and palaces and factories and workshops were empty. No candles were lit. The streets were silent. All the city was assembled at the ziggurat. Fires burned on the temple heights, but Abram did not look long in their direction. He did not say the names of its gods. He never did. As the Elohah led Abram into the desert, Abram looked north and saw torches far off on the trade roads and felt that familiar pang of worry. Martu, Amorites, coming down in droves. Why was the news always bad? Everything spoke of upheaval. The Amorites were moving, the Medes were expanding, and the northern cities of Mesopotamia were fostering armies. But it was the nomads that alarmed Ur's thinking people. Why were there so many? Massive human migrations are never a good sign. There was talk among the officials of building a wall to keep them out, but that would take time, and the horde was already here. Abram stopped worrying. The God was ahead of him, out in the desert, where the fragrance of the palms was less. Abram hurried to keep up. Abruptly, the Elohah stopped, facing west. Abram stood as close as he dared. Casil, the giant, was rising into the sky. "It's time to go," the God said. Abram jumped. "Go? Go where?" He thought of his father, Terah, off at the festival. He thought of his brother, Nahor, the businessman, and Haran, buried in the fields of Ur. It smote his heart to think of him. Who would pick the weeds from that grave if he left? At least there was Lot, Haran's son, and the spitting image of his dad. "My father," Abram began, when the God turned. Abram stopped. Time was in that face. Whole ages swept under it like dust in the wind, and even the lifespan of a star was nothing but a spark shooting out of a fire. "Come with me," the God said. "Who are you?" Abram suddenly asked, because that was what he desperately wanted to know. Who was this Anunana or Anunanki or some other occupant of the limitless thrones? The God did not give his name. He replied instead, "I am El Elyon." Abram froze. He could not breathe. He sank to his knees. El Elyon, could it be? God Most High, chief of the gods, indeed their maker. By that time, the Sumerians saw creation as being drawn out of Namu, a primeval sea, and the latter gods emerging from illicit unions between the earth and sky. But to be God Most High, this God had to be another thing entirely. "Speak, Lord," Abram said. "I'm listening." The God drew near. He laid a hand on Abram's shoulder. Abram looked up. "Go to the land I'll show you," El Elyon said. "Go now." Abram nodded. He stood. Behind him was Ur, the crown of civilization. It was a city of markets and wide streets and the crying of gulls, of ships from afar and chariots and slaves and drinking in taverns and fields of grain and massive skilled armies. It was a formidable place, and it had stood long. Though Abram could not know it, in less than a century, all that would be gone. "I'll go," he said. So he did. Abram sold his possessions. He surrendered his stall in the market. His house went to unfamiliar faces. They swore they were Sumerian, but they had Goody accents. Fine. Abram readied his household, and they got out of there. We are at the end of Genesis 11. And in the final verses of that chapter, something happens, something that is almost impossible to miss. Up to that point, the story roams back and forth across the world. It visits legends and frames disasters and speeds through whole centuries. The cities of Cain rise and fall. The Nephilim business takes place. The flood occurs, and Abram's venerable ancestors live out their long lives. In Genesis 10, the story surveys the known world, so in that chapter alone, dynasties bloom and vanish. The world is peopled, and early civilizations spread across the river plain. The Babel event, which took some time, occurs. In fact, the book of Genesis covers more time than the rest of the Bible put together, and Genesis 1 to 11 covers almost all of it. No wonder, in Genesis 1 to 11, the Bible establishes our problem. And though we've seen it already, it's vital to note that by the end of the Babel event, humanity has three problems. These are death, sin, and spiritual oppression. Through Adam, death and sin enter the world, though death is emphasized in Genesis 2 and 3. The day you eat of it, you will die. Sin makes its big debut with Adam's son, which we also saw. Sin is crouching at your door, its desire is for you, and you must rule over it. Spiritual oppression is there all along, in the presence of the serpent in the garden, in the Nephilim episode of Genesis 6, and in particular at Babel. By the end of the Babel event, the nations of the world have been subjected to the rule of lesser gods, and though certainly not all of these rebel, humans bring in the ones that do. Humans set up temples and idols and invite the rebel spirits in. There is also something of a fourth problem, a bridge between sin and death called iniquity. Iniquity is inherited evil passing through people and environments. It is sons attaching to their fathers and inheriting their ruined neurobiology. It is generational curses and intergenerational trauma flowing like a river through the human genome. Cain became like Adam, only worse. Lamech became like Cain, only worse. Iniquity lives in the ground from which the blood cries out. It is the irrigation systems of the Sumerian Empire, which brought so much salt from the mountains that in the end nothing would grow. It is corrupt political institutions that cheat widows and enslave orphans. The reformist kings of Judah had to do an enormous amount of bureaucratic work alongside their other responsibilities just to straighten out the effects of iniquity on their governmental systems. It is a real mess, as much today as it was then. When Abram appears at the end of Genesis 11, the action slows down to a crawl. The rest of the book is going to deal with Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and Joseph. The rest of the Torah is going to follow one character. With Abram, God intervenes. He finds a covenant partner. Collaboration is kind of his thing.